All right, we should be able to finish out this lecture here in this part two. So, excuse me. So what we'll do now is to turn attention towards the military kind of campaigns that Louis XIV began to engage in as he began to flex his authority. As the leading state of Europe, oftentimes, there's this effort to um, amass even greater amounts of political and geographical, you know, authority. And so Louis XIV and his ambitions were no exception to that. During his reign, France would develop a professional army, a standing army, numbering some 400,000 men in wartime, making it one of the largest, if not the largest army of continental Europe at the time. And he would use it. It would be involved in four major conflicts during Louis's reign. Um, to highlight the first three and then to focus greater attention on the last one. Basically, in 1667, the French began to or tried to invade um, Spanish held portions of the Netherlands. Um, the Dutch, the English, and the Swedes formed a triple alliance in order to kind of keep France in check. This is very commonplace. Anytime there's a uh, predominant power in Europe, the other powers of Europe usually ally themselves in order to keep that one power or one or two powers in check. So this activity was pretty textbook. Just a few years later, in 1672, France retaliated against the Dutch and were able to negotiate a peace which left France in charge of and as sovereign over the Franche-Comté, which was a province on the French eastern frontier. Um, this emboldened France to begin to make plans to attack the Holy Roman Empire itself. So here we have the Franche-Comté here. These are the what were the Spanish-held portions of um, the Netherlands. By 1689, Louis XIV was back at it with what was called the War of the League of Augsburg. This was a costly conflict where France expanded its control over the Alsace-Lorraine region, again, this area, and also, in an effort to combat that, or kind of again keep France in check, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Sweden, the Dutch, and the English once again rallied to limit the extent of French gains. But early in the 18th century, in 1702, there would be another opportunity for France to begin to expand its interests in Europe. And that came in the form of what is called the War of Spanish Succession, as you can see, lasting from 1702 to 1713. This was arguably the most pivotal of these four wars. The background here was that Charles II, the established sitting king of Spain, was sickly and childless. Um, and as a result, he would become the last Spanish Habsburg. He'd become the last monarch of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Because he had no heir to pass on his throne to, he left his throne to the grandson of Louis XIV. This grandson would later become King Philip V of Spain. When that was made public, the threat of a new Bourbon dynasty that united the Spanish and French thrones would potentially upset the balance of power, the European balance of power. And so as a result, rivals to France were concerned that this would not be could not be permitted. And as a result, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Holland, and the Habsburg Austrian Empire joined together to challenge French and Spanish alignment. This was a pretty long conflict. It involved the colonial empires in the Western Hemisphere and elsewhere, just as the previous kind of wars that I sketched out a few moments ago also did. And so, as a result, not only were you having to fight war in Europe, and wars are expensive, but you also had to fight and kind of defend territorial holdings around the world, which was increasingly expensive. By 1704, at the Battle of Blenheim, the Allied forces were able to defeat the French, largely due to the military capabilities of a young John Churchill who commanded the Allied forces there. This battle proved to be a pretty pivotal turning point. And by the end of the conflict, the treaty or the Peace of Utrecht was responsible for serving to end the war. And the terms were included the following. First and foremost, the Bourbon dynasty was able to keep control of the Spanish throne. France and Spain, however, would remain separate powers, even though they were governed by, for all intents and purposes, the same family. The Spanish Netherlands, Milan, and Naples were surrendered by Spain to Austria. So these areas here were handed over to the Austrian Habsburg family. And the Germanic Principality of Prussia gained territory and with it influence, becoming and beginning the process of becoming one of the most powerful principalities within the Germanic state of the Holy Roman Empire itself. England gained possession of Gibraltar, which is basically this small little outcropping of rock that polices the traffic moving through the Straits of Gibraltar from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean and from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic, a vital strategic point that was, very crucial to England's authority and power in Europe. England also gained control over colonial holdings in Newfoundland, the Hudson Bay area, and Nova Scotia, basically taking possession of what had been French colonies. And also as a result of this conflict, the War of Spanish Succession, England began to emerge as a major naval power. And this is the source of England becoming a dominant global power as a result of its perfecting its ability to patrol the waters in and around Europe, but also the high seas as well. And this would help to keep French continental power in check. So England had, moving forward, would have an increasingly dominant navy. France would have a pretty formidable army, by and large. So here, the absolutist state of France was an empire on the rise by the mid 18th century. But there were certain lessons to be learned here. France was grappling with the limitations of its own policies in many respects. Absolutism was as constricting as it was ambitious in many respects. And the more power that was amassed in the hands of the sovereign, the King of France himself, the more the state suffocated itself in many respects, through things like lavish expenses, mercantilist policy, domestic insecurity, largely as a result of this police-like state and the constant kind of monitoring of people's intentions and actions, foreign rivalries, and also expensive wars. I mean, you can see that France was in an adversarial mood and in an adversarial position in the neighborhood of Europe itself. And again, because by the 18th century, the 1700s, the major powers of Europe are becoming increasingly imperial powers on a global scale. England, France, Spain, the Netherlands to a large degree, although that was mostly a commercial empire. These are really powers of Europe that are jockeying for position within the continent, but also have broader um, uh, ambitions as well. And so, any time that there was going to be the potential for conflict within Europe, in many cases, you that meant that there would be conflict wherever uh, English or French or Spanish or Dutch kind of interests were in close proximity to one another on a global scale to help kind of keep power not only in check but just in a state of churn and potential or perpetual instability. So that gets us an understanding, at the very least, of the kind of absolute kind of aspects of French political authority. Now, that's should act as something of a foundation because no sooner before the end of the 18th century, France was going to go through its French Revolution, which would not only seek to dissolve or kind of gravitate away from autocracy in this absolutist kind of expression of political power, but it would also liquidate, it would also execute, behead the um, the monarchy itself, and result in the creation of a French republic, which we'll get into. But this kind of uh, these kinds of characteristics exhibited under Louis XIV and his successors, Louis XV and Louis XVI, meant that you know France was just um, the definition of hedonism, and the ordinary kind of rank and file members of French society were the ones that were suffering as a result of the corruption, the abuse, not only fiscal abuse, but also just um, this divide between the haves and the have-nots was going to just be too much to bear by 1789. So we'll in between now and then we'll talk about the Enlightenment. We'll also talk about the kind of emergent American identity as Americans begin to associate themselves as more Americans and less as British subjects as we turn attention towards the American Revolution as well, and then the French Revolution, which we will be getting into not this week, week 3, but more week 4. So stay tuned.